Okay, welcome to Peeling Syd Barrett. This will be episode 29. And in this episode, what I'd like to do is discuss a few songs. Well, a couple really. I want to get into Feel, which was released on the Madcap Laughs album in January of 1970. And that is track 11. And I also want to discuss Dolly Rocker, which was released later on the Opal album. And that's track 5 on that album. And that was released in October of 88. And was recorded much earlier, between 68 and 70. So, I'm also going to discuss a little bit the song I Never Lied to You, which I believe we kind of mentioned. I haven't totally broken down that song, but we did mention it to some degree, I believe, in our episode on apples and oranges, because those ideas are kind of tied together. And I want to tie these two songs together, Feel and Dolly Rocker, because they do have something in them that is a bit related. So, that's why I want to break those down in the same episode. Now, before we get into all that, I want to discuss some corrections and comments that people have made. We do have a new subscriber, so thanks for subscribing. I asked them if they wanted to be called out, and I haven't heard back from them, so I won't call out them specifically until I hear back from them saying, yeah, it's okay. So the first thing that I want to call out as something I missed is that in the Effervescing Elephant breakdown, I forgot to include something from Nonsense Books by Edward Lear, Boston, Little Brown and Company, 1941. And that is a picture of an enthusiastic elephant, very similar to an effervescing elephant. So the enthusiastic elephant ferried himself across the water with the kitchen poker and a new pair of earrings. I don't know, whatever that's about. But I will just point out that the ferry and the water there are kind of tied together. And that ties in with our breakdown of Effervescing Elephant and how that may be related to Mr. Barrett's dad. Of course, the idea of going on a ferry across a river is or across a body of water, is quite significant symbolically. And that ties in with our interpretation of Effervescing Elephant, the song. There's another reason to believe that the interpretation that we've given is correct, and that the interpretation that most people give is entirely incorrect. Okay, so there are two things really that I want to discuss. There's one more. It's a correction of some kind, and it ties in with the I Never Lied to You song. So in the song I Never Lied to You, I just want to point out very quickly that when we mentioned that before, the fourth line of that it starts off saying that there's going to be a lot of people around in a hall, and this person won't even know if you're there at all. And then they rhyme the words yard and hard, and they say there won't be anybody very hard. And I have specifically wondered for quite some time what could be meant by that term hard. And I'm going to provide a link of a discussion of Pink Floyd and a bootleg copy that was kind of early on. Now, in previous episodes, it was either in episode 1 or 2. I believe it was our very first episode. I discussed the history of CCR and Mr. Fogarty and his concern with the music industry being a little bit dirty and having some kind of criminal elements to it. And I want to point out that may be the case in quite a few places, and that may be what is meant by nobody there being very hard. In other words, you don't have to worry. There won't be any people that are hard or tough guys or thugs. Now, the video that I'm going to link is going to have somebody, I don't know who he is, but he's basically asking, he goes through his kind of talk, and he basically states that if you know the address of whoever created the bootleg or got a hold of whatever the music was that was kind of stolen, he'd be very interested in knowing what that address was. And he kind of says that with a bit of a smile. And perhaps he's not I guess what you would consider to be, you know, a tough guy or a thug or something. Perhaps he's just pretending to be that way to elicit a response, but he does seem to at least want to give the impression that he's a strong man and that there's a little bit of a threat in his smile. So I'll give the link again. You can check that out. So I do wonder if that's what isn't meant by the statement that there won't be anybody hard there. In other words, it's kind of a promise, maybe, that it won't have those types of people there at this get together. Maybe it's a promise of some kind. I don't know. So that's pretty much it for corrections. Now there are two questions, or one question and a statement, and I'm gonna go off topic just a little bit here. Now, someone asked a question. And basically, they had two things that they wanted to know about. So one was that Mr. Barrett apparently had seen some kind of a breakdown of him and his work, and he mentioned that it was just kind of a bit loud, and he didn't really like it much. And and then also there is kind of a question about why are people so interested in him and in his work. So, in response to that, now I've kind of looked up these things, okay, and I'm going to go ahead and cite them for you, the specifics, so that we all know kind of what's being discussed. Now, the first is these are instances that are relayed by Mr. Chapman in A Very Irregular Head, The Life of Syd Barrett. Again, I do suggest that you get this book if you're that interested in Mr. Barrett and Pink Floyd and the history and everything. Mr. Chapman is very, very good at relaying personal stories. Now, on page 370, page 371, is a discussion of the various people that would just kind of show up. And in particular, Rosemary is quoted as mentioning all these kind of strange women that would fixate on Mr. Barrett and thought that they were going to marry him and everything. And she mentions also that there are a lot of kind of disturbed people that can kind of fixate on someone. And she mentions poor John Lennon, and I will say yes, justifiably so. Poor John Lennon, and I don't know that I necessarily believe entirely that was just caused by some kind of nutty fan. John Lennon had managed to make himself quite a few political enemies, so perhaps that's something that was going on. I don't know. Now. The other thing that I kind of would like to call out is on page 373, and there's a mention there that when Rosemary broached the topic of an exhibition of Syd's work, he kind of was incredulous. And let's see, what is the word? Oh yeah, he uses incredulity at the notion, of course, that anybody at all would be interested in his work. Who knows now if that's just his painting, or if that also includes his work as a musician. So, and the last thing I guess that I'll call out that is part of the question that they include is on page 387 of the same book, second paragraph. Rosemary again tells the story that he was watching this documentary, and Mr. Barrett said it's just kind of noisy, and the music is noisy. Okay, so let's try to answer then what could be meant by these two questions that this person has posed, which is why would anybody be interested in the music, and why would Mr. Barrett just kind of complain that the music or that the documentary itself was kind of loud? Okay, so there's really two questions and two parts, at least to the why would anyone be interested question. So I'm going to leave that one for a bit. So I don't want to make a habit of this now. I'm just relaying my opinions, and I'm relaying information as far as I can tell. Now, please don't believe in any way that I am speaking for Mr. Barrett. I cannot do that. I do not believe he is easily understandable by anyone. He had put together his own kind of way of using language, and we can kind of try to get some ideas of perhaps what he might have meant, but I am not directly interviewing him. I do not have direct contact with him. I do not know the answers to these things specifically 100%. All I can do is kind of put together the information and make some guesses, and then you'll have to kind of decide on your own. All right, so the first thing that I want to kind of call out is page 376. This is in regards to the loud question. Is relaying the idea that, quite specifically, that Mr. Barrett didn't like listening to people talking. He liked to listen specifically to different types of music, like jazz, when he was creating things. And I'm not sure who's relaying this information. I believe it's Rosemary. So she would know better than anybody else, I believe, that what his normal working kind of environment was. She relays that he liked to listen to jazz. He liked it being quiet. And she also mentions that he didn't like having a lot of talking going on because he was trying to work through things in his head. And quite a few people, for me, I'll just be honest. For me, it is very hard for me to concentrate when people are talking around me. And it is annoying sometimes. And that includes even the television or anything else. So perhaps that is something that a lot of people feel when they are trying to organize thoughts or trying to think about things. And there's discussion going on. Discussing the sound of people's voices can be extremely distracting because your brain almost inherently wants to track it. Your brain almost inherently wants to try to follow a discussion even if you're not involved. So it can be very disconcerting to be trying to work on things and have people specifically talking. Now, the second thing that I will point you to that may help to answer this, I guess, is that we've discussed this before. There was an interview, and I'll link it here, where there's a classical musician critic who is interviewing Syd Barrett and Roger Waters, and he specifically uses this exact line, that he finds the music to be very loud, and it is not agreeable to him. And perhaps it's just because he's worked with string bands, or I don't know exactly what he said. But you can see Mr. Barrett almost immediately smile and turn his head away. And partially that's probably because it's insulting. It's a very insulting thing to say to someone, that you just don't like their music and you don't think it's any good and it's very loud. Now, Mr. Roger Waters either doesn't really pick up on that, or he's just much better at having a stone face, but he goes on to answer things, and Syd tries to explain kind of where he's coming from, but I want you to notice that this guy kind of cuts him off. And I don't really... You should watch the clip, okay? And Mr. Barrett is the kind of person who's kind of... You can tell from the interview that he's kind of an inner person, that he is trying to relay information, but perhaps because of his demeanor, this other guy, this critic, is, and I don't know if he's Dutch or German, he has kind of an accent. He's just kind of stepping on him and stepping on his music and even interrupting him. He's interrupting the person that he's interviewing. So it's very rude, and I would have to say that for someone that is of a certain temperament, like Mr. Barrett, we have mentioned before that people may have been taking advantage of him. Here's an example of someone who appears to not even realize that what they are doing is insulting to Mr. Barrett, or could be taken that way, and Mr. Barrett is in some ways allowing it to happen. Perhaps it's because of his background or his upbringing, and he's trying to avoid direct conflict, and he's trying to avoid an argument. I don't know, but in my opinion anyway, there's a confrontation of sorts that's happening there, and you can see that Mr. Barrett's initial response is to immediately recognize the conflict and then choose to demur. And of course, he won't always choose to demur. Mr. Waters, however, seems quite comfortable in the situation, and either he's comfortable with the confrontation or perhaps he doesn't recognize it. I don't know. Of course, he hadn't written most of that music, so he wouldn't have been quite as offended by it. But you can see Mr. Barrett kind of smile and look away, like this guy's kind of he's just kind of a square. He's not hip to whatever the Beats were doing. He's part of an old school, and you shouldn't trust anyone over 30, I think was a saying back then. So perhaps that's something that's going on. Anyway, I've gone off on a tangent. My point is, what could Mr. Barrett mean by the documentary being loud? So in his own language, he may have meant that he was repeating what this man had said, that it was very critical, it was kind of stuffy and old, it was perhaps he agreed in a way with the guy, and that the music was actually kind of loud, that the music type for that period of Pink Floyd he may have felt was kind of loud. And again, I'll just restate, as we have mentioned, that Mr. Barrett's solo work was a lot more folky and just acoustic guitar oriented. Not entirely, but largely. So that's what he may have meant by loud. Now, for the second question that this person is asking is, why are people kind of interested in Mr. Barrett? Well, I know why I'm interested in Mr. Barrett, and I can speak to that. I can't speak to everyone else, but obviously, as we mentioned from Very Irregular Head and the stories of Rosemary and people, various people relay the idea that there were just kind of people that would show up and think that they were going to hang out with Mr. Barrett, which is a little bit absurd, but it is understandable. And the reason for that is, of course, because not only was Mr. Barrett creating interesting music, but he was giving music that was, at least in his solo career, it was very personal. So you can tell that, and we've discussed the nature of romance poetry. You can tell that he's touching on these topics, of course, that are very emotional, and people are emotional. And of course, I do believe that a lot of people would have noted that he was feeling lonely, and perhaps they would have been willing to try and help him. But as we've discussed many times in our previous episodes, people are unique, and Mr. Barrett, for whatever reason, was trying to remove himself and was tied to people in his past, and you can't simply replace people, and he couldn't. And for other people to think that they could just step in and replace the people of his life is a little bit absurd. But perhaps it's well intentioned. I'm certain there are some people that just wanted to get photos of him and irritate him, but I suspect that the vast majority of people that actually would have liked to have met him wanted to try to help him because there were aspects of him that they kind of commiserated with or perhaps had sympathy for. So they probably were thinking that maybe they can help him out. Maybe they thought his songs were asking for help. I don't know. Now, why am I interested in Mr. Barrett is because I think there's way more going on to Mr. Barrett than people realize. And as I have mentioned on numerous occasions, I think people have vastly misunderstood him and his music, and I'm very tired. And I just saw another documentary on Mr. Barrett that someone produced to put together all the shiny pictures with all the strange, bendy, psychedelic effects on the photos that I suspect they don't even have copyright to. And they were more than happy to give their opinion, of course, that Mr. Barrett went crazy and that it was because he was abusing psychedelic drugs and everything else. And I'm just really tired of it, personally. I mean, I think those things simply aren't knowable. So it's I guess it's something people really enjoy, you know, like looking at pictures of pretty ladies, and I don't even know. It's just dumb. It's just really dumb. So that's why I'm interested in Mr. Barrett, because I think there's a lot going on with him. I think he's a very complicated person. I enjoy the challenge of trying to understand him as much as is possible, and in doing so, trying to understand what he may have been going through, because I think it's important. And the reason I think it's important is because I think that quite a few people of the beat poet kind of generation, including men like Bukowski, had recognized that, at least for them, that there was something outside of general pop culture that was necessary for them to achieve meaning and inspiration. And I believe that's kind of something that Mr. Barrett may have been going through. And in understanding that, perhaps I can process it and apply it to some degree. So hopefully I've kind of outlined why people are interested in Mr. Barrett. Now, I want to read to you certain things from a Rolling Stone interview of Mr. Barrett. This is one of the last interviews with Mr. Barrett. And of course, at the end of the interview, he says, I'm not anything you think I am anyway. Now this, I'll give the dates for when this interview was had here on the screen. But, what exactly does he mean by that? What does he mean that he's not anything that we think he is? It may be an entirely logical and honest and truthful statement. We may have entirely misunderstood Mr. Barrett. And I will give another kind of a quote here, or at least another kind of a story. And oh geez, let me see. I'm going to try to find it here really quick. Basically, it's relayed by either Rosemary or so on page 373 of Very Irregular Head, middle paragraph, there is a Miss Susan Sontag who specifically says that quite often a modern artist becomes quite silent, and although they don't become literally silent like Mr. Barrett did, more often they do become quite silent to the general public. And she kind of mentions that it's a kind of an artistic purity in a way, but it does exclude the viewer, or it does exclude the general public. And there was one more quote I kind of wanted to mention here. I'll just kind of, if I can find it, I'll put it up on the screen, the page number, etc. But it's that he actually was just kind of living a very simple and boring life, and people don't seem to really understand or want to believe that he was just kind of living a very thoughtful, simple life. So I'll include that page number here if I can find it. Now, going back to this Rolling Stone interview, Mr. Barrett, I want to say here, there is a paragraph where he mentions the work that he's been doing, and he says that he's really the only work that he's done in the last 2 years is interviews, and then he says that he's really good at it, which is, if you don't recognize the humor in that statement, I don't know what to tell you. But that is extremely complicated humor. The idea that the only work that he's doing really is interviews, and that he's gotten pretty good at it, is funny. And if you don't think that there's something coherent going on in his head, then, in my opinion anyway, you're not going to get Mr. Barrett. So, and Mr. Waters, of course, thoroughly discusses this idea of a twisted sense of humor in the idea of practicing a song called Have You Got It Yet? And you can probably go, that's kind of a legendary story, honestly, where Mr. Barrett shows up and he's got a new song and it's called Have You Got It Yet? But it's just constantly changing key and nobody can follow along with it. And eventually Roger Waters figures it out and he's just kind of like, okay, I got it. Yeah. I got it. I got it. I'm not going to get it. So I got it. And then he was done. And that's kind of the same idea that this guy, at times, Mr. Barrett, is entirely capable of really messing with people. And in a way, they don't even seem to be recognizing that he's entirely messing with them because he's doing it in such an obtuse way. And the other thing that I kind of want to point out in that statement is, at least in some ways, we know that he was thinking about the idea that he hadn't really been doing very much, and perhaps that was bothering him, which also kind of is in line with the idea of someone like his father, who was kind of a hard worker all his life and worked all the way until his death, even while he was suffering with cancer. So let's go ahead then, and I guess that's about it, really. I just wanted to point out that there are aspects of Mr. Barrett that are very interesting to me because of the nature of the work, the nature of the person, and if you understand those two things, they add to one another. And also that it seems that there's quite a bit of complexity to this man, and that it can be quite rewarding to go through his work, as we'll find out here in just a minute. So what I want to do then is I want to, I forgot. One last thing. Should I do this one now? I'm going to save it. Okay, I'm going to save it. So Jose Lamsfuss was one of the people that normally gives us questions. He posted a question, or he posted a comment about the nature of Rimbaud and one of Mr. Barrett's songs, Swan Lee, that we had been discussing, specifically about the waterfall. So I'm going to get to that at the end of this episode. So hang on and we'll get to that part. Okay? So the first thing I want to do is run through these two songs lyrically. So the first song that I want to discuss is called Feel. So if I can find a lyric version, I'll post it, and if not, you can maybe just pull up the lyrics on your phone, and I'll use my lyric book. Now, I will say one thing: the lyrics of Syd Barrett book, I have found now 2 songs that had lyrics in it in this book that I was not aware of before. So for me, that's rewarding. And again, I didn't suggest this book for everyone, and I don't know that I still would. I probably wouldn't suggest it for everyone, but it has been very valuable to me for those 2 songs, and when I get to them, I'll mention them. So let's look at the lyrics for Feel. I'm not going to get into the music necessarily for that song because it's pretty simple musically. So he mentions that you can feel him, and away and empty and so alone, and that he wants to come home. So he's rhyming alone and home. Not very much alliteration. Now this kind of line of words that is missing punctuation and just kind of a run-on is throwing ideas at us, of course, that you can feel him, and things are away and empty and alone, and he wants to come home. Now, as we just mentioned, people, of course, have felt, perhaps fans and other people, that they could help him. It's songs like this, obviously, that would make them want to believe that he could help, because of the fact that he was apparently hurting quite a bit. So perhaps they felt that they could help him. I don't know. Now, he mentions in the next line that you can find him inside of a nocturne. Now, a nocturne by the night, the blonde. So here again is mention of the blonde, and we have specifically gone through this idea of a blonde again and again, and you have to eventually come to the conclusion that this is either a muse of some type, or it is a type, almost like an archetype, a subject of affection, a subject of perhaps extreme devotion, or an ideal, or perhaps even a continuing relationship over a very long period of time. He mentions that that they love him to be by their side, they wail. So in other words, there's a they, very specifically a plural, that other people are wailing for him to be by their side. The implication, of course, would be, I suppose, other women wailing for him to be by their side or wanting to be with him. And that fits our previous discussion about why people maybe perhaps are kind of fixating and interested in him, and why he's not. Because he has an ideal already, whoever this Nocturne the Blonde is. Okay, now the next specifically says that there's a crab on her side, singular. So perhaps he's again speaking of the Nocturne the Blonde. And that she is straggling a bridge by the water. Now, I don't totally get straggling. Now, a straggler, of course, is someone who's kind of left behind. So, someone has straggled. So, I'll just kind of point out that the crab is on her side, which is singular, which appears to be modifying or referring to the blonde. So, perhaps the crab is referring to someone that is a crab that's by her side, that's straggling a bridge by the water. We'll get to that perhaps again later, but this crab appears to be with the blonde. Why? I don't know. It could be an astrology reference. It also could be kind of, I guess, a smaller someone. It could be a reference to a smaller someone, perhaps a crab with hands that grab. So a clutchy person, which most children are, right? Most children are kind of clutchy and they want to hold on to things. Okay, so let's keep going on. There's mention that she misses her craw. So what exactly that means, I don't know why craw is being used there. Perhaps claw. I mean, crabs have claws. I don't know what a craw is. It may be a slang term of some kind. There's mention of Fowlie growing, and then heady aside in Adele. Now, there's alliteration with a D sound. There's mention of being inside, and he's the lonely one. And there again is a mention of my bride. Now, we've previously discussed the use of my bride instead of my wife in Julia Dream. Here is another use of bride instead of wife. Why bride is being used, I do not know. But it is consistent with Julia Dream. Okay, so let's keep going. They mentioned that how he leaves on the waddling wheel, and they flail. I don't know what a waddling wheel is. These inventions of words are quite interesting. There's a gasp, shringing. What is shringing? I don't know. Again, there's another made-up word. There's bad bells ringing, and then a mention of the angel, the daughter. Now, we already have discussed the possibility that this crab might be someone small by their side. So the blonde side is a daughter, perhaps. We have thoroughly discussed the possibility of this daughter in Scream Thy Last Scream. That was a reference that was made in that song to a daughter. And why he's making that reference, I don't know. Is it a literal daughter? Is it a symbol of a daughter? Is it a metaphor for something else? But we would be remiss to just assume that there is not an actual possibility of a daughter, an angel and a daughter, or perhaps a hope of one. Who knows? So now we can go back to that previous line that was in plural, and we can say that it says, how I love to see you by my side, they wail. So this could be more than just other people or other women wailing. This could in fact be a mother and a daughter wailing for wanting to be with him by his side. Okay, so let's go to the last verse. He mentions being empty and alone again. He wants to go home. And you'll find him inside of a nocturne. And there's a crab by her side, and she straggled the water. Okay. So, interesting kind of points there in that song. Now, the other song that I want to review really quickly is called Dolly Rocker, and this will become apparent here in just a moment. Now, I really love Dolly Rocker because the guitar, the rhythm of the guitar is beautiful. I don't know how he does it. I love it. I'll try and learn how to play it. Maybe I'll cover it later. I don't know. But for now, I'll just say it's one of my favorite songs musically that he made. It's very simple, and it has a beautiful sound to it. Okay, so he says he knows a sweet girl, and she went and paid for him. And then he says, done a sweet girl. So done, of course, doing could be a sexual reference. And he mentions that after 5 they went for tea, and she saw a dolly rocker. A dolly rocker is apparently a kind of dress, which I believe Mr. Barrett mentions at the beginning of the song. But look at the next line. It specifically says, she wants a girl, she got her. And then he says he wants to see her. He knows he does. I love you, darling, all for you. Okay. So, who does he actually want to see? There's two things being mentioned here, two people. He saw a sweet girl and he spent time with her. And then he mentions that she wants a girl and she got her. So he wants to see her. Who? Her. The daughter he wants to see? He knows he does. Is that, and who is this all for? We've specifically mentioned going through all these things for the benefit of another person, which is in our breakdown of Birdie Hop. So I have to ask the question, of course, is all this work and all these things, all these beautiful songs, are they being created to kind of capture the moment, to capture the emotion, to capture the feeling of the wondrous beauty of these things, of the relationships, of the emotions that are felt? Quite a romantic feeling, and you would expect nothing less from a romantic poet. Continuing to the next verse, you want to meet Pearl, and that she's cute as a squirrel's nut. Okay, so a pearl obviously is a small, beautiful thing, quite a lustrous, beautiful thing, and that she's very cute. Now, who is Pearl? Someone else entirely, or is it one of the two people previously mentioned? Of course, now we know that there's a mention of wanting a girl, so perhaps this Pearl is in reference to a baby girl, much as the previous song in Feel was calling out someone as a crab for being kind of clingy. He mentions that she done see me, and she thought that she got the lot, or that it was great. He wants to wait till he got her. She's Dolly Rocker. And said, she knows, I know, we know, I do. And she wants to see him lonely with you. Okay. So, and of course, many children, of course, that are caught between parents like this obviously would want to see their parents together. So perhaps that's what's being relayed there, that idea. The last verse goes, oceans can travel, very long. Of course, there's a reference to the oceans traveling. Again, same as the sea being green, which we mentioned in Jug Band Blues. So, being away so long, senses in the gravel. So there again is a mention of gravel or dirt. And I don't recall which song that was. I mean, how many times has he called being down to ground, etc. It's kind of a repetitive theme in his poetry. He mentions seeing yourself at home. It's nice to be at home, and then he says that that's all there'll be forever, and it's all his life when you got her. And of course, when you got her what? A dress, or of course when you got her, the daughter. All you know, I know. Through your head, pushed you, baby. A dolly rocker. She know what she got her. A dolly rocker. Okay, so those are quite a few references to the possibility of a daughter. You can choose to take that however you like. I believe in our discussion on apples and oranges, we broke down the story of perhaps Mr. Barrett believing that he had a daughter in some way. Easily understandable by interpreting these songs. He may have felt that way. And at any rate, that's all kind of tied up in that idea. Now, I will say a few things here that are anecdotal to me. Okay, just to make that clear, anecdotal to me. There are many reasons why this could, of course, show a kind of a broken relationship, come easy go, or not established, and I believe no good trying is where he mentions that someone is wearing or is hiding their hands because he's not like them, which could be an implication, of course, that he's not willing to get married. If you want to read it that way, you could. This could be kind of a broken relationship of some sort that required stability, and so there was a separation, even though there was a lot of emotion tied to that relationship. I know of at least two cases, and then I will do one last one for you. So the two first ones I'll do are anecdotal. I knew a man who had a son. And this man, he loved to work. He would come to work all the time. He was a very hard worker. He loved working. And his son was a good-looking boy and a very handsome fellow. Was, kind of a lady killer. And he hooked up kind of young with a girl that he liked very much. Now, the guy that I knew was his dad, and his dad was a hard worker, but they were not rich. They were kind of, I guess you could say, lower middle class. And the son was not very stable financially. He got his girlfriend pregnant. The family had her have the daughter, but they did not allow the daughter to be raised by, they did not allow the granddaughter to be raised by the daughter and the daughter's boyfriend. They had the auntie of their daughter raise the daughter as her own for the stability. I don't know how it ended, but I do know that my friend, who was the dad of the boy that I worked with, he was kind of upset by that, but what could he do? They weren't going to be able to raise the daughter on their own, and certainly that wasn't something that was possible. So that's one bit of anecdotal story. Another one is that I taught someone who was adopted, and she was adopted also by her auntie. And the reason that she was adopted by her auntie was because her own mother was kind of a really hard worker, single mother that didn't want to have her career upended by having a daughter. So she financially supported the daughter, but she had her sister raise her own daughter. And this girl, she was very well balanced and totally fine with the situation. She knew who her real mother was, and or who her birth mother was, and she was fine with it. She was completely stable, emotionally stable, and quite happy, to be frank about it. She was quite happy with the situation and seemed to be doing well. So there are two stories of people that I have known that have, for various reasons, not been able to be with their birth parents. Now, are there reasons why Mr. Barrett perhaps would not have been the kind of person that you would have wanted to raise a child? It seems almost like a ridiculous question. Of course, specifically if you were of the impression that perhaps he was unhinged, or perhaps even if you believed that there was a possibility that he was a habitual drug abuser, then of course you may not have allowed him to even be around his own birth child. Now, that seems a little bit cruel to a lot of people. That idea may seem a little bit cruel, but perhaps eventually that was worked out and he was able to at least see in some degrees a relation that he may have had. I would like very much to believe that that's a possibility. And if he did leave everything behind with Pink Floyd and all the fame and all the fortune and all the shoulders pressing in the hall and all the big parties and the feasts, if he left it for one reason, and that if that reason was that he wanted to be around family, and if that family may have even been perhaps a daughter, what a beautiful thing. To be honest, what a beautiful thing to think that this man may have been willing to throw all that away for what was really valuable. And what may have been really valuable could have been spending time with family. So I'll just throw that idea out there. I don't know that. Again, that's just my own personal opinion, but it certainly is a possibility. Okay, so the last thing I guess that I want to get into is what Mr. Jose Lamsfus brought up, which is that, of course, there is poetry by Mr. Rimbaud, and that there is a very specific poem that ties in with the ideas of a waterfall. And so I do have works by Mr. Rimbaud. I haven't read through all of this. I'll give you the information about it. Rimbaud, Complete Works, Selected Letters, a bilingual edition. Now, the bilingual edition is important for me, of course, because I don't speak or read French. Translated with an introduction and notes by Wallace Fowlie. I'll also note that there is a picture of Rimbaud by Picasso on the inside page, which is pretty cool. Copyright 1966 by University of Chicago. I don't know. University of Chicago Press, Chicago and London. Okay, so there are quite a few things in this book that are really, really wonderful. And the reason I have this book is because I'll point you to a book by about Jim Morrison, which I've quoted before. And the reason I have this is because I was quite interested in Jim Morrison a while back, and so I read quite a bit about him. So No One Here Gets Out Alive, Jerry Hopkins and Danny Sugerman, Warner Books, and 1980 copyright. So in this book, one of the influences that they call out on Mr. Morrison very specifically is Rimbaud. And they call out a number of authors. So they mentioned that Mr. Morrison was into Nietzsche, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Life Against Death by Norman O'Brien, Arthur Rimbaud, etc. And that these were all people that Mr. Morrison extensively read. So I picked up most of those books to read through them to try to understand them to some degree. Now, Rimbaud is... he is not, I guess, considered to be a romantic poet or a romance poet, and I don't really know why, because that's really what most of his stuff is about. I guess they call him kind of a precursor to surrealist poetry or symbolic poetry. At any rate, I'll give you a list of romantic poets. Here are the English ones: William Blake, William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and John Keats. Those are the most notable romantic poets in England. Well, not necessarily just in England, of course, but in the English language. For French, Marceline Valmore, Alphonse de Lamartine, Alfred de Vigny, Victor Hugo, Aloysius Bertrand, Gerard Naval, Théophile Gautier, Alfred de Musset, and Charles Baudelaire. Of course, we have already discussed Charles Baudelaire to quite some degree. So one of the poets that perhaps isn't considered to be a romance poet, which is a little bit unfortunate because I think he was inspired by quite a bit of the romantic ideal, is Arthur Rimbaud. And he put together quite a few really wonderful really, really wonderful poems and quite a bit of great poetry. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because in our discussion on Swan Lee was mention of Swan Lee finding his lady, and there's a waterfall. And let's see, I'll get you the exact lyric here. Silas Lang or Swan Lee, I'm not sure how they would have written it down. Oh, Swan Lee. So the very last verse before the chorus is that there's a rush of great thunder, and this confronted Swan Lee, and in the dawn he found a squaw and was paddling homewards. And the verse just before that is mention of following this person, Swan Lee or Silas Lang, following his ears to a great waterfall. Now, that great waterfall is kind of mentioned in Mr. Rimbaud's poetry. Okay, so sorry about that. I wanted to tie together my ideas kind of on Rimbaud, and it's a bit disheveled, so let's go ahead then, and I'm going to call out a poem from the Illuminations called Dawn, and Jose, I'm supposed to mention this. So there is a bit in Dawn which I can't give you the entire English version because it's a translation from 1966, so it's still under copyright. I will only call out the portion that is interesting to me as it relates to possibly discussing Silas Lang or Swan Lee, which is, he mentions that he laughed at the blonde waterfall which tumbled down through the pine trees, and at its silver top I recognized the goddess. So there is a blonde reference tied to a waterfall and a goddess of some kind. There also, I will point out, is a poem not long after that, which is this 22, 23, 24, Daily Nocturne. And of course, we just ran through a song calling out his nocturne, The Blonde. So that's tied to another lyric, which is from Feel. Now, there are other ideas, I guess, that I would like to kind of relay in Mr. Rimbaud's writing that does seem to be quite similar to perhaps some of the things Mr. Barrett was trying to relay. One of them is, I guess, from The Orphan's Gift of New Year's, the second part of the poem. I'm not sure which line of it is, but basically it mentions that like beautiful birds rocked by the branches, sleep their sweet sleep full of white visions. So there's a mention of visions tied to sleeping, which of course we have mentioned as something that seems to be along the lines of what Mr. Barrett does express. There is another wonderful poem called Sensation, in which Rimbaud says, he will not speak, he will not have thoughts, but infinite love will mount in my soul, and that he'll go far off. So the idea of being overcome with just an emotion and not speaking and not having thoughts. The next one that I would like to point to is a poem called Ophelia. Isn't that interesting? We thoroughly break down the symbolism of this in our discussion on See Emily Play. So one of the passages mentions that for 1,000 years Ophelia has passed a white phantom down the long black river. For more than 1,000 years, her sweet madness has murmured its romance to the evening breeze. That also thoroughly discussed within the symbolism, at least, of See Emily Play, perhaps not directly. What poem is this? This is A Season in Hell. The very first lines of it, long ago, my life was a banquet where everyone's heart was generous and there was wine flowing. which is, of course, similar to Wined and Dined. And also, I'll put the other song here. We've discussed that already. I Never Lied to You, I believe. The beginning lines of I Never Lied to You, very similar to that idea. And the last of Rimbaud's poems that I would like to call out is a poem called Vowels, where he ties specifically colors to the sounds of vowels. So A is black, E is white, I is red, U is green, O is blue, those vowels. And one day he will tell you, he says, one day I will tell your latent birth. He mentions a black, hairy corset of shining flies. And he ties in a bunch of imagery together with the sounds as well as colors. So quite a few people have mentioned that Mr. Barrett liked to tie things together with colors. Here is Arthur Rimbaud doing something very similar in his poem Vowels. That's really pretty much it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you some things to think about. And again, I gave quite a bit of my own personal interpretation in there to assist in possibilities, but I will just state again that we simply do not know what these things may have meant to Mr. Barrett. We do not know what specifically he was relaying, but there does something to be quite wonderful, and I will add, in my opinion, quite beautifully honest. And in my opinion, that is the mark of great artistry. That is the great artist. That is the great beauty of not just painting, but music. It is the great beauty of poetry. It is the great beauty of writing and stories of any form, and relaying personal things as well as you can. And that is perhaps why I find Mr. Barrett to be such a wonderfully interesting artist, because not only is he tying up certain things about himself and reviewing them, but he's also kind of putting it out there for everyone to see and discuss and consider, and that is the mark of a beautiful artist. So that's it for today. I'll see you folks later.